June 22nd, 1941. The German Wehrmacht pours across the Soviet border, confident, battle-hardened, and undefeated. They are the masters of Europe, having crushed France and Poland in weeks using the lightning speed of the Blitzkrieg. Their intelligence reports assure them that the Red Army is a hollow shell, equipped with obsolete agricultural tractors that will crumble before the might of German engineering. A German anti-tank crew spots a green silhouette cresting a hill. It looks different, sleek, angled, almost alien compared to the boxy tanks they are used to destroying. But they aren't worried. They man their 37mm anti-tank gun, a weapon so precise they believe it can kill anything on tracks. The gunner lines up the shot. He fires, a direct hit. But instead of the earth-shattering explosion of ammunition and fuel, there is a high-pitched, mocking ping. The shell spins harmlessly into the sky. The green monster doesn't stop. It doesn't even slow down. As the turret slowly rotates toward the terrified German crew, their laughter dies in their throats. They are about to discover that their primitive enemy has built a weapon that will make their own technology look obsolete overnight. To understand the sheer terror the T-34 caused, you first have to understand the mind-boggling arrogance of the German military in 1941. Nazi ideology wasn't just political rhetoric, it had seeped into military planning. The Germans genuinely believed that Slavic people, the Untermenschen, or subhumans, were incapable of sophisticated engineering. In the eyes of the high command, the Soviet Union was a rotting structure kicked in by the Bolsheviks, capable only of producing crude, heavy machinery that would break down before it even reached the battlefield. When Operation Barbarossa launched, German panzer crews were riding high. They were driving the Panzer III and Panzer IV. These were marvels of comfort and optics. They had radios in every tank, excellent sights, and highly trained crews who operated like a symphony. They had swept through Western Europe, destroying British Matildas and French Char B-1s. They felt invincible. German intelligence regarding Soviet armor was catastrophically wrong. They expected to fight the T-26 and the BT-7 light tanks. These were indeed older designs, thin-skinned, riveted boxes that could be destroyed by heavy machine gun fire. The Germans were so confident in their superiority that their standard infantry anti-tank weapon was the 3.7cm Pak-36. It was a small, lightweight gun that had performed adequately in Poland. But even before the invasion, the German soldiers had a joke about this gun. They called it the Heeresanklopfgerät, the army door knocker. The joke was that if you fired it at a tank, you were just politely knocking on the door to ask the crew to come out and surrender. They laughed about it because, until June 1941, knocking had been enough. They assumed the Russian tanks would be so poorly made that the door knocker would punch right through them. As the invasion began, the Wehrmacht sliced through the Soviet lines. They captured thousands of prisoners and destroyed hundreds of those older, obsolete Soviet tanks, just as they had predicted. It seemed the war would be over by Christmas. The German generals wrote home about the poor quality of Russian equipment. They mocked the lack of radios and the crude finish of the captured vehicles. They saw the Red Army exactly as they wanted to see it, a disorganized mob with farm equipment. But deep in the Soviet interior, hidden from German spies and completely unknown to the West, a designer named Mikhail Koshkin had been fighting his own war against bureaucracy to produce a tank that prioritized one thing above all else: survival. The Germans were busy laughing at the tractors they were destroying on the border, completely unaware that a new beast was waiting for them just a few miles east. The laughter was about to end, and the legend of the door knocker was about to become a grim reality that would cost thousands of German lives. The shock came within the first 48 hours of the invasion. Near the town of Grodno, elements of the German panzer divisions ran into a counterattack. Out of the smoke emerged the T-34. German gunners did what they had always done. They waited for the enemy to close to 800 meters, a comfortable killing range, and opened fire with their 37mm and 50mm guns. They watched the tracers fly true. They saw the impacts. Sparks flew off the front of the Soviet tanks. But the tanks kept coming. Panic set in. The German gunners let them get closer. 600 meters, 400 meters, 200 meters. At this range, a hit should have torn the target apart. Instead, the German crews watched in horror as their armor-piercing shells simply ricocheted off the T-34's front plate like pebbles skipping off a frozen pond. The T-34s didn't just survive. They closed the distance and began physically crushing the German anti-tank guns under their wide tracks. One famous account from the 1st Panzer Division describes a single T-34 that drove right through a German line. A German Panzer III moved to intercept it. The Panzer III fired shell after shell, hitting the T-34 repeatedly. The Soviet tank ignored the fire, turned its turret, and fired a single 76mm round. The Panzer III was obliterated. The German crew bailed out, shocked to find that their own tank, the pride of the Wehrmacht, was helpless. The reports that reached German high command were initially dismissed as hysteria. "It is impossible," the general said. "The Russians cannot build a tank that is immune to our guns." But the reports kept coming. Soldiers described a monster that could not be killed. The situation became so desperate that German infantry had to resort to suicide tactics. They would wait for the T-34 to pass, climb onto the back of the moving tank, and shove grenades into the engine hatches or wedge mines under the turret ring. It was the only way to stop them. The 3.7cm Pak-36 earned its door knocker nickname for real during these battles. Crews reported hitting T-34s 20 or 30 times with zero penetration. The only weapon the Germans had that could reliably stop a T-34 from long range was the 88mm flak gun, an anti-aircraft weapon designed to shoot down bombers at 20,000 feet. The Germans had to lower these massive artillery pieces to shoot horizontally at tanks. If an 88 wasn't available, the German infantry was essentially defenseless. In one legendary encounter near Rasenii, a single T-34 tank stalled at a crossroads. For 48 hours, this lone tank held off an entire German combat group, Kampfgruppe. It destroyed anti-tank guns, supply trucks, and blocked the advance of thousands of soldiers. The Germans eventually had to distract the crew with light tanks, while an 88mm flak gun was secretly rolled into position behind it to finally knock it out. When the Germans inspected the wreck, they found the armor covered in shallow dents, scars from dozens of German shells that had failed to penetrate. Why was the T-34 seemingly invincible? It wasn't magic. It was physics, specifically the physics of sloped armor. Before the T-34, tanks were built like boxes. The German Panzer III and Panzer IV had vertical plates of steel. If a plate was 30 millimeters thick, the shell had to penetrate 30 millimeters of steel. Simple. But Mikhail Koshkin, the T-34's designer, realized that if you angled the armor plate back at 60 degrees, the shell had to travel through more metal to get inside. A 45 millimeter plate sloped at 60 degrees offered the protection equivalent to 90 millimeters of steel. But the slope did something even more important: deflection. When a high-velocity shell hits a flat surface, it digs in. When it hits a steep slope, the energy is diverted, causing the shell to slide or bounce upwards. This was the ping that haunted German dreams. The T-34 was lighter and faster than heavy tanks, yet it carried the protection of a heavy tank. Then there were the tracks. German tanks were designed for the paved roads of Western Europe. They had narrow tracks. In the Russian autumn, the roads turned into a deep, glue-like mud called Rasputitsa. German tanks sank to their bellies, their engines screaming as they tried to pull free. The T-34 had massive, wide tracks that distributed its weight. It didn't drive through the mud, it floated over it. German crews would watch helplessly from their bogged-down panzers as T-34s maneuvered around them with ease. The weaponry was the final nail in the coffin. The T-34 mounted a 76.2mm high-velocity gun. In 1941, this was overkill. It could punch through the front armor of any German tank from 1,000 meters away. The Germans, conversely, had to get within 300 meters, suicide range, to have a hope of hurting the T-34. The shock was so profound that it shook the German military hierarchy to its core. General Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg and a man not known for praising the enemy, inspected a captured T-34. His assessment was blunt and devastating. He wrote in his diary, "The T-34 is the finest tank in the world." He urged the German High Command to simply copy it. This led to a humiliating moment for German engineering. The Daimler-Benz company proposed a new tank design that was almost a direct photocopy of the T-34, complete with the sloped armor and diesel engine. The German pride eventually rejected a direct copy, leading instead to the development of the Panther tank. But if you look at a Panther and a T-34 side by side, the lineage is undeniable. The T-34 forced the master race to admit that the subhumans had outdesigned them. If the technical superiority of the T-34 was a shock, the industrial reality that followed was the death knell for the Third Reich. The T-34 wasn't a precision instrument like a Swiss watch. It was a hammer. German tanks were over-engineered. They had leather seats, polished welds, and complex transmissions that required specialized maintenance. They were beautiful machines, but they were slow to build. The T-34 was built rough. The welds looked sloppy. The transmission was so stiff that drivers sometimes had to use a sledgehammer to shift gears. Inside, it was cramped, loud, and lacked a floor basket, meaning the loader had to dance around spent shell casings. It had no radio, forcing commanders to use signal flags. But none of that mattered. While Germany was obsessing over making perfect tanks, the Soviet Union was obsessed with making enough tanks. They stripped the design down to the bare essentials. As the Germans advanced, the Soviets physically dismantled their factories, put them on trains, and moved them behind the Ural Mountains, out of range of German bombers. There, in freezing open-air factories, women and children worked 16-hour shifts welding T-34s. The numbers are terrifying. Germany built about 1,300 Tiger tanks and 6,000 Panthers during the entire war. The Soviet Union built over 84,000 T-34s. For a German tanker, this was a psychological nightmare. You could be the best ace in the Luftwaffe or the Panzerwaffe. You could destroy 5 T-34s in a single day, displaying incredible skill and bravery. But the next morning, as the sun rose over the steppe, you would look through your binoculars and see 10 more T-34s cresting the hill, and then 20, and then 50. It became a war of attrition that Germany could not win. The door knocker joke wasn't funny anymore. The T-34 became the symbol of the Soviet counterattack. It was the spearhead at Stalingrad, the shield at Kursk, and the hammer that smashed down the gates of Berlin. By 1945, the T-34 crews were driving through the rubble of the German capital. The arrogance of 1941 was buried under millions of tons of rubble. The Germans had laughed at the tractor tank, mocking its lack of polish and the people who built it. But in the ultimate irony of World War II, it was the rugged, mass-produced, primitive T-34 that ended the war parked in the shadow of the Reichstag. The lesson of the T-34 was written in the burning wreckage of the Panzer divisions. Mocking your enemy is easy, but physics and industrial might don't care about your ideology. The tank that bounced the German shells bounced the Nazis all the way back to Berlin.